International Women's Day is a global day marked annually on March the 8th to celebrate the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women. This year's theme is Choose to Challenge. A challenged world is an alert world, and from challenge comes change. So let's all choose to challenge. If we could move on to our next slide, please. So we've chosen to use this theme to talk to women about challenges in the broadest sense. The professional challenges that they're addressing, how they've personally tackled these challenges, and how they've challenged others. We have 3 events this week to celebrate International Women's Day. Today, Dervilla Mitchell is going to be in conversation with Kate Bingham, the chair of the UK government's Vaccine Taskforce. This is followed on Wednesday, the 10th of March, with a panel conversation with women across ARUP UKIMEA. And finally, on Friday, please join us when Eva Hinkers will be in conversation with Olivia Finch from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on the challenges of the circular economy. And if we can go on to our next slide, please. So I am delighted that we have Kate Bingham joining us this morning. Many of you will recognise Kate, who in May 2020 was appointed chair of the UK Vaccine Taskforce, reporting to the Prime Minister to lead UK efforts to find and manufacture a COVID-19 vaccine. Kate was educated at St Paul's Girls' School in London, at Christ Church, Oxford, where she gained a first-class MA in biochemistry, and then at Harvard Business School for an MBA. In her 29 years with SV Health Investments, she has led biotech investments and activities, as well as drug discovery platforms in a broad range of clinical areas. Kate also played an active role in setting up the Dementia Discovery Fund, the DDF, and serves on the DDF Investment Committee. Kate won the Lifetime Achievement Award presented by the Bioindustry Association UK in January 2017. She also serves on the board of the Francis Crick Institute. And at weekends, Kate spends time in Wales, where she rides horses and mountain bikes, grows vegetables and competes in bog snorkeling competitions. I'm sure that has some very different challenges involved with it. Leading the conversation this morning is Dervilla Mitchell. Dervilla is our current chair of the UK IMEA region and a member of the group board. And in April, she'll be taking up a new global role focusing on the people and influence pillars in our strategy. So I'll hand over now to Dervilla and Kate.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Caroline, and a big welcome to you, Kate.
Thank you for having me.
Sure, very welcome. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say to the audience that you are only going to see pictures of Kate and I and hear our voices today, as that's what technology is enabling us to do this morning.
I apologise to everybody, it's my fault. I'm calling you from a weak internet connection and it's not worked out for me. So I apologise to everybody, but these are the challenges we face.
Yeah. Well, you're not to worry about anything here. It's to hear the messages and to have our conversation today is the important thing. So we have in this call staff from all over the UK, India, Middle East and Africa. We'll have men and women, even though this is a Connect Women event. And we'll have people who are in technical roles and non-technical roles. And we do have some other external colleagues and clients, so welcome to them as well. So the topic, choose to challenge. And I thought I'd explore with you, Kate, being challenged, finding challenge yourself, as well as providing challenge to others. And I wonder if I could start with a little bit about your background and leave the vaccines till later, because I'm sure people will have lots of questions on that. But first of all, how did you get into life sciences?
So I got into life sciences, Dervilla, because basically I was, by accident is the answer, because when I was choosing A-levels, I wasn't particularly focused on sciences. I was really focused on playing lacrosse and playing my oboe and singing. Those are the things that I minded a lot about. And at some point, my headmistress then said, what was I going to do for A-level? And I said, well, I could do geography, I could do biology, but there were lots of things I could do, but I wasn't sure what they were going to be. And she said, well, could I do science? And the answer was I could do science, as probably as well as I could do geography. So she then basically told me to do physics, chemistry, biology as my A-levels, which I duly did. And it was after that that I really started getting excited by the opportunities of actually how science can change the world in lots of different ways. And so I really got into science by accident.
That's a great story, because often we are most successful when we don't choose the path, but the path opens up for us. But having gone to this all-girls school, you know, did you feel that that enabled you in your later career, or did you find there were adjustments to make as you went to university and at the start of your early career?
So actually, I think that going to an all-girls school was incredibly helpful, certainly to get the confidence to go into science and then not to be put off by lots of incredibly pushy and effective men. So actually, I did end up going to a very male college at Oxford, which at the time I joined was 5-to-1 men to female. And my headmistress at the time had told me if I did go to what she called a man's college, which had basically only recently started taking women, I needed to promise not to ever darn any man's socks, which of course is a slightly old-fashioned statement, but I got the point, which was, you know, do your own thing and make sure you stand up for yourself. And actually it was fine. And so I didn't worry about it. I certainly was pretty daunted by how good everybody was. And I certainly didn't feel like I was as strong scientifically as lots and lots of my peers. But I didn't really notice this aspect of the fact that I was a woman versus everybody else.
And when you think about women going into STEM today, or actually anybody going into STEM today, do you think that schools and universities could do more to enable people to really look forward to a career in the sciences?
I think so, yes, because one of the things that that you have with science is there's really quite a lot of quite dry material you've got to learn so that you can start to understand the basis of whichever subject it is. And you can't just go straight into understanding the niceties of genetics without actually understanding the basics of how different cells work and how they divide and replicate and so on. So I think the real skill from a teaching perspective is how can you bring to life some of that quite dry science so that it's actually meaningful to people. And for me, I think certainly at school, I started understanding more about the potential aspect or the potential use of science to develop medicines and therapeutics. And the one that by the time I got to Oxford, I did one specific course on clinical biochemistry. And this was the time where it was well understood at that point how, for example, cystic fibrosis works. And this is where you have a mutation in the chloride ion channel, and the chloride channel isn't able to act as it would do normally, which leads to all the different symptoms that and the cause of the disease to do with, you know, lung dysfunction and GI dysfunction and so on. And what I found absolutely fascinating was how the understanding the genetics, in this case in CF, actually translated directly to symptoms and the lack of, you know, physiological function, and what the different approaches were therapeutically to actually addressing that. So I think, going rather long-winded answer, Dervilla, sorry, to your question about how can teachers do more, I think making science real and showing that both an understanding and a practical application of science can have a very tangible effect in ways that people can understand, because people can understand, you know, the treatment of disease. And it doesn't mean you have to, you know, be able to recite the periodic table, but you do need to be able to understand the fundamentals of how that science leads into disease.
That's great, because we will have in our business quite a lot of people who are STEM ambassadors, and their job is to go out into schools and talk about, you know, the jobs they do. And I'm hoping that that also helps support and enthusiasm to keep going with your sciences and maths, and even consider a job in engineering. So there are many routes, but that's very helpful. Thanks, Kate. Now, thinking about your career, is there a particular point or many points which you think have been influential in shaping you and getting you to where you are today?
I mean, I think there's lots along the way. I mean, I certainly think for me, the biochemistry experience as an undergrad was really important because it actually gave me a sense, first of all, that I really like the science and the opportunity of what scientific discovery can do in terms of development of new medicines and in also new vaccines and diagnostics and so on. So that I thought was really important. But the other aspect of it was that I wasn't actually the right person to be in the lab, because I'm far too impatient and I want results. I want everything to happen yesterday. So that was an important aspect just for me to learn about myself, which is I really like the topic, but I'm not going to be the innovator. I'm not going to be coming up with the new discoveries myself, because that's just not my personality. So that was, I guess, the first aspect. The second one, I think a big game changer for me was spending time as an intern at what was then a startup biotech company called Vertex Pharmaceuticals, which actually also has ended up making its name in cystic fibrosis. And again, for me, as part of applying to business school, you have to explain why going to, in this case, Harvard, was going to change my life, and it was all part of my long-term plan. And for those of you listening today, I'm sure lots of you don't have a long-term plan. And although it's good to have one, most people probably don't have a really crystallized plan. So my essay to Harvard basically said, I had to sort of design one, which was about how studying biochemistry was important because I enjoyed it and I thought it would have a big impact on the world, but that I really wanted to get a strong business training, and therefore being in one of the two major world-leading centers for biotechnology was something that was important to me. And that's why I then applied to Harvard, because of course Cambridge, Massachusetts is probably the major hub for biotech. And so then when I got to Harvard, I then wanted to figure out, well, how can I actually follow through with this? And this, for many of you, again, on the phone, can't imagine it, was in the days before the internet. So the ways to get a job then was to write letters or to pick up the phone and speak to people. And it was pretty clear to me that writing letters was not going to end up with anything positive. So I worked out that if you called at sort of 8 in the morning, if you managed to have somebody's direct line, you had a pretty good shot that they would pick up the phone themselves. And so I called a lady at Biogen who was running R&D at the time and asked her whether or not she'd give me an intern job. And she said, she laughed and said, you know, thanks very much, but no. And then she paused and said, but you know what, my friend has just started a biotech company. Maybe he would appreciate a pair of hands. So she gave me the name, and Rich Aldrich at Vertex. So my next call was to him to say this particular individual, Vicky Sato from Biogen, had suggested I called him, and whether or not he might be interested in giving me an intern job. And Rich's reaction was to say, oh, well, look, if Vicky suggested it, come on down. And of course, I'd never met her. And she had no idea who I was from Adam. But it was that lucky break that I had to get into working with a biotech company. And for me, what the role that they asked me to do was to work with their senior scientists who had come up with an invention that bore no relation to the core business. And he was getting distracted by it. And so what they wanted me to do was to basically do anything to help develop and explore whether or not this separate invention was commercializable, but not to let him get distracted with his day job. So for me, that was absolutely game changing, because it was basically a sort of precursor to what life as a venture capitalist is like, which is you've got a novel piece of data or scientific insight, and then you've got to figure out whether or not this has any commercial relevance. And if it does, how are you going to prove it? And what is the market you're going to go after? And how are you going to build a competitive edge and build a business? So for me, that was absolutely brilliant. So I wrote patents, I wrote grants, I put together a business plan, and subsequently actually went to work at what was then Schroeder Ventures. But that company was then duly spun out, and actually ultimately went public. So that was a real game-changing point for me, because it was all about risk and ambiguity with no obvious path. It's not like there's a job where if you do a good job, you don't get promoted. This was something which was, we have no idea whether or not this is going to be interesting or not. And as it turned out, actually having gone public, the company ultimately failed. So although it made a lot of progress, it didn't ultimately work. And that, to me, that was a very important impact for me as to how to think about risk and uncertainty and how to balance things. And then I guess there's been lots of examples of that since then at SV, because I spend my life working with amazing academics who have new insights to alter the course of cancer or inflammatory disease or dementia. And the question is, how can you actually leverage their expertise with a nimble company building ethos, so that you can actually explore to see whether or not these things might work. So where I've ended up has all been a bit unexpected, but it has been a really good training for ending up, as a venture capitalist in this space.
That's really interesting to hear your journey and how you managed that through certainty and uncertainty. As a leader today and managing teams, how do you balance stretching people, keeping them motivated, and enabling people to find their strengths and directions as you did?
So the first thing, Dervilla, is to basically behave as you would wish others to, in part, so to set a role model. And so for me, that's all been about non-hierarchical teams. So I've never worked in a large company, and I've only ever worked with small companies. I mean, either sort of very nascent or small companies, and our business itself is also small. And so there's never been a case of, well, I'm too important to do this job, and so you should do it. So I think that sense of willingness to roll your sleeves up, no matter what it is a sense of building teams and sort of respect for others. That means that we're all doing this together, and we'll just juggle up the different things that need to be done. So I think the sort of non-hierarchical, set an example as you would like other people to work, is helpful. The other thing is just, and this is something that, looking back, I wish I was better at it when I was younger, but basically seeking and receiving feedback. So when you're starting out in your career, it's very easy to think that feedback is completely game-changing and threatening and difficult, and you worry about it. And if all they say is you're wonderful, that doesn't actually necessarily tell you very much. So what you really want is constructive, ongoing feedback, which you would both give and receive. And so that's something that I certainly do with our teams. And if someone's done something really good, I will tell them immediately that I think they've done really well. And I might send them a box of chocolates, or something just to show that they've really done a nice job, and also to be public and call them out and say this has been really good. And equally, I think it's about seeking feedback from others to say, well, how could I have helped you more in this, and what could we have done better? And so we do go through things that we call, lots and lots of our companies and products fail. And so then we do systematically have postmortems. What did we do? Did we make the right decisions? How could we have done better? And we recognize that we are in a business where we're going to have lots of failure, but we need to make sure we learn from failure as opposed to try and avoid it. So in some ways we do embrace failure, but we just want to make sure that when we fail, we can make sure that we don't fail for the same reason again, so that we can be smarter. And again, for me, the big turning points generally are where things go wrong, because you learn so much more about things going wrong than when things go right.
That's interesting, thinking about you allowing things to fail more, because as a structural engineer, failure is such a horror to me because it's life-threatening. So maybe we are a little less risk, or we're more risk averse than maybe in your business, but it's something really to think hard about, is that. I was going to move on to the task force now, Kate. Tell us about the day you got that call and your reaction. You know, what did you think? Did you hesitate? Were you prepared for the public scrutiny that would follow?
So I guess the call, so I had a first call was on the 1st of April, which was from Patrick Vallance asking whether or not I would join his expert vaccine advisory group. And my reaction to that was, I'm not a vaccine expert. You know, why would you be including me? To which the answer was, well, you are surveying small companies and innovative landscapes, and would like your insight on that rather than, you know, the detailed vaccine aspects, which of course there's lots of other experts in vaccines per se. So that I started that, and that was really an arm's length advisory group to the government, thinking about, you know, what vaccines and what their vaccine strategy might be. So we had meetings through April with that advisory committee, and then there was actually during the last meeting at the beginning of May, when I got a text from Matt Hancock during one of those meetings asking me whether or not we could speak. So I spoke to him after the meeting, and that's when he asked me initially on behalf of the Prime Minister whether or not I would join as chair of a vaccine task force, which was then going to be set up with a dedicated team and, you know, real weight behind it. And that at that time, again, I had no idea why he was calling me, and I just simply didn't anticipate it. So when he asked me, I was completely gobsmacked and basically said, you know, I'm not qualified. I don't think I can do this. I had a classic imposter syndrome of, you know, there must be better people to take on this role. And I remember Matt Hancock saying to me, you know, we're all learning doing this for the first time. We're all learning. And, you know, this is a time of national need. So I asked for 24 hours to think about it. And obviously spoke to my family, spoke to a whole bunch of people who had worked with government and who had worked for the private sector, who understood that balance between the private sector working in government, just to be sure that what I was being asked to do was something that I could do. And so I did feel confident, actually, after that 24 hours, that I would be able to at least do what was needed, which was to identify the vaccine landscape, or triage the landscape, identify the most promising vaccines, and if there were vaccines that could be developed that would be successful, I was reasonably sure that we would have a good shot at finding them. My real question was whether or not it was going to be ever possible to get a vaccine against this novel coronavirus. Because again, in May, it all looks very easy now, but in May, there was no vaccine that had ever been developed for any human coronavirus. And so we had no path to follow. We had lots of different vaccine formats that we could evaluate, but nothing that said, actually, if you follow this route, you've got a good shot. And so it was massively daunting. And when the Prime Minister called me straight after that and said, would I do it? The main message that I wanted the Prime Minister to hear was that the chances of this working were small. And so for me, setting that sort of expectation was really important, so that he did not think that this was just a matter of, you know, PPE procurement. This was much more complex than that. And there was no certainty that any of this would work. And there was certainty that money that we would spend, some of that would get lost, because we would be making commitments to vaccines before we knew whether or not these were likely to succeed. And that is obviously, again, a very uncomfortable position for any government, to be spending public money knowing that some of this is going to be wasted.
So it seems to me that when you described your earlier career and when you described that, both occasions, you're going into things where there isn't a clear path, where there's quite a lot of uncertainty, there's a huge amount of ambiguity. Is that something you sort of feel you thrive on?
I think it probably is, actually. haven't really thought about that so much, but I think if there are all clear answers, it makes it much less interesting. Everything I do is uncertain. You know, this is a miracle that any drug ever gets developed, ever, because it is so difficult and so many things go wrong, and biology is so complex. So actually, I think I do like the uncertainty, and the way I think about how do you handle uncertainty and risk is making sure that you bring the best possible team around you to help make those decisions, look at the data, and come up with expert judgments. So I think the big mistake is trying to think that you have to do it all yourself, because of course you don't. What you need to make sure is that you have people that are much better than you, who are able to look at all aspects of the different, in this case, vaccine data sets, to be able to then prioritize and say, well, you know, we think this data looks really strong, that's likely to direct us to a greater sense of you know, confidence in that one being successful versus others. So I do quite like the uncertainty. And then when, of course, you end up with data the other end that says, yes, this vaccine in this case is safe and effective, then, you know, the joy of seeing that data is just, you know, unbelievable. It's amazing.
And before I move off the vaccines and allow some of our audience to have some questions as well, is, you know, when you look back on that process, the uncertainty of the outcome, the choices you had to make about different vaccines and what you were backing, what are the lessons learned for, you know, in procuring the vaccines and getting us to such a successful position that we're in now?
Well, I think there were a bunch of things that were helpful, specifically for the Vaccine Taskforce. So I think the first one is the sponsorship and the support I had literally from the top, so from the Prime Minister and from Sir Patrick Vallance, I think was really important. And I think it was important because it allowed us to work at a speed and in a way that probably broke all the rules in government. So, but had I not had that support at the top level, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So that was, I think the sponsorship and support was important. The second thing is the acceptance of the risk. So recognizing that what we were going to do was high risk and that we were likely to lose money by backing, you know, the manufacturer, for example, of vaccines before we knew whether or not they would be safe and effective. So that was something that, again, I think was unusual for government, but really important to the success that we were able to deliver, which then fed into pace. So, I mean, there's been all sorts of stuff in the press about, you know, which country has done what and how and so on. But our focus was absolutely on getting successful vaccines to the UK as soon as possible, because every day saved would be lives saved. So the getting to that point where we could have one or ideally more than one vaccine that was effective and safe and approved by the regulators and delivered so that they can start going to arms. That was what our common mission was across the team. So acting really quickly. Leadership, I think, was helpful. And I, again, brought a very strong team, each of whom are leaders in their own field, to lead on the different aspects of what we were doing. And they were experts. And so I think that, again, is always critical when you're dealing with something quite as complex as this. And then I think the whole sort of agile governance, being able to, I mean, it goes back to pace really, being able to make decisions quickly was important. And so, for example, dealing with all aspects of the contracting and supply agreements, and for example, supporting the different manufacturers if they needed support with manufacturing or fill finish or with running clinical trials in the UK, being able to offer and secure funding to provide that support quickly meant that actually companies were then willing to work with us, because of course the UK is tiny. We have a population defined by the JCVI as being vulnerable of about 30 or 32 million people. So those are the people over the age of 50 and adults with underlying disease. And so actually in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty small compared with European Union or Japan or the US. So we had to figure out how we could be a nimble, effective customer, as it were. So how could we make ourselves most attractive so that people would actually choose to develop their vaccines in the UK and supply the UK rather than supply other countries, so that we could actually ensure that we secure vaccines for the UK as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. So I think those, I think those lessons of sort of sponsorship, risk, pace, leadership, expertise, governance are aspects that actually can apply across our broader business world. Actually, whenever we're taking on high risk projects, how can we mitigate that risk and maximize the chances of success?
I agree. They're absolutely, completely transferable, all those points you've mentioned. And whether it's high risk or just what we'd consider normal in the business, I think we should consider, all those points. I'm going to move to the questions that are coming in from our audience now. And my usual way of doing these is taking them in the order in which they're received. And the first one was, to you, Kate, what have you done in the past year to look after your own health and well-being?
Well, first of all, don't take yourself too seriously. I learned a lot through the whole sort of media tirade in sort of November, December-y. Was very clear that if you take yourself too seriously, you would have a nervous breakdown. And the feedback I was given very clearly was, take your ego out of this. Just continue to focus on doing your job, because the job we were doing was great. And I was entirely confident that what we'd put in place were very sound plans to build a promising portfolio for the UK. And so don't get deflected, and don't let flack coming at you stop you from actually doing the job that you were asked to do. So I think one thing is don't have a big ego. The second thing is just keep some things, or for me, it was just keep some things that were sort of normal. So while I couldn't actually get out every day to exercise because it was just too manic, I did try very hard to exercise as much as I could. And I've got a very strong one of those outdoor head torches where they look like sort of a car headlamp. And I'd be running around the lanes in the dark, just listening to podcasts or doing whatever, just to try and clear my head, so that you're not constantly stressed by the multitude of different things that are going on at the same time. And singing, the things that lighten the mood and make you happy. And music is a great joy, and listening to music or just singing in the bath, anything like that, I think helps. But the answer is I don't think I've hugely suffered with mental health, and it's just a matter of get on with it.
Yeah. This next question goes back to something you mentioned earlier, imposter syndrome. So I'll read it, it's a little bit long. In my career, I often struggle with imposter syndrome, or not being assertive enough to put myself forward for opportunities or present my work and take credit, especially being a woman in a male-dominated world. Have you ever experienced this throughout your career? And if yes, how do you overcome this? And do you have any advice? So I think you've given us an example. Maybe there's another example, or the advice, the tips to how you address that.
I think it's really hard. And certainly as a young person, when I was starting off in my career, I felt it quite a lot, and then thought, well, if you work hard and make sure you nail whatever task you've been asked, that would make a big difference to how you're then perceived, and you'll be looked at because of your expertise, not because of I don't know who you are or anything else. And I do think it's difficult, and it's all about actually having confidence in yourself. And when I was thinking about the Vaccine Taskforce, once I got over the fact that I wasn't a vaccine expert, and why would they be asking a chair who wasn't a vaccine expert to take that role. And when I gave it enough thought to say, well, actually, what were the skills that they wanted, and did I have those skills? Once I got myself into that perspective, then I would absolutely go into bat to say, yes, I have exactly the right skills that were needed here, which is build a team together, assess the landscape, prioritize based on the data, the incomplete data we have, take experts and make judgments about what to do, go in and negotiate with the companies, but do so in such a way that's cooperative. So those sorts of things were absolutely what I've spent my last 30 years doing as a venture capitalist. So when I framed it in a term where I was confident, actually then it was very easy. So I guess one aspect of the question here is see if you can, when you're not confident about whether or not you can take on other jobs or roles, see if you can frame it in a way where it increases your confidence to do that. Because people who know me would not think of me as being an unconfident person. But it's when I'm being put into something that I think I'm way over my skis, I think anybody would feel that they are less confident. So then, frame it in a way where you are quite clear that you know what you're doing and you can get and you can make that contribution.
So really, what you're describing there is understanding and playing to one's strengths, really. I'm not trying to play into somebody else's strengths, perhaps. So the next question is, throughout your career, did you feel more professional support or sponsorship or mentorship from women than men? Do you feel it's specifically important for women to support or mentor younger women?
Well, the latter is, of course, and I think it's incredibly important that senior women are visible to junior women and mentor them and help them, because they themselves have gone through the different career plans and progress that the younger people are going to be going through. So I think that level of visibility and mentorship and support is completely critical, yes. On my own mentorship, actually, I was mostly mentored by men, which was fine. And it was partly because I didn't really notice whether I was a woman or a man. But having become a senior woman, I am incredibly committed to women. And in fact, our organisation at SV, in a very male environment, generally in financial services, we have wonderful diversity, and a large percentage of our company's CEOs are women, and certainly all the C-suite would include more than one woman. And I would not sit on a board that didn't include women. So now I'm at a senior level, I'm actually able to influence that a lot more than I could have done as a starting off in my career. And I do think sort of mentorship and being, again, it's about feedback and taking it and receiving it. That sort of thing, I think, does matter. Mm-hmm. And, we're in much more ambiguous careers now than, 50 years ago, where people could choose to go into a profession and then, they're in that same job forever. Nowadays, people are not going to be doing that. So you have to be much more articulate about what you want and seek to get it, but without it being too aggressive and too pushy. Because I think there are drawbacks. And I certainly have worked with some women that are so focused on sort of career advancement that they forget they've actually got to do a job, and that, they're not going to advance in their careers until they've demonstrated they can, they're worthy of advance. So I think it is important, just to get your head down and do your work, but not be too shy about saying where you actually want to end up.
I'm going to skip a question because it links to what you were just saying. So the next one I'm going to ask is, talking about feedback. How do you ask for constructive feedback effectively? Coming from a junior member of staff who struggles to receive constructive feedback despite asking. So this is putting your mind in a younger person's shoes and trying to ask for that.
Well, interesting. I've got it with my daughter now, who's working at a fabulous startup, and she, for her, it's all her experience has been about, and it absolutely mirrors with my own experience. So it's all about the beginning. You're uncertain because you've not been in this role before. This is a new company. it's your first job. And so you don't want to put a foot wrong. But actually, if you don't give feedback or ask for feedback, you're not going to get better. And so one of the benefits of lockdown from her perspective is that, unfortunately, I guess for her, that she was living with mum. So I was sitting there, just as she prompted me and made me assess my own imposter syndrome with the Vaccine Taskforce. I've been able to encourage her to say, look, if there's something you actually want to do and you're serious about it, well, you need to tell somebody, which means you have to go to the different people involved, your managers and people involved in recruitment and building the organization, and talk to them about where you would like to ultimately end up. And then again, ask for the feedback to say, what do I need to do to get there? Because if you don't ask, you can be quite sure you're not going to get it. And if you do ask, and they give you some useful feedback and say, you know, we'd like you to have spent 6 months doing this, or a year doing this, or read these books, or do this course. Again, if you don't ask for that feedback, you're not going to get it. So I'm somewhat reliving it through my daughter, and I think being proactive, and I mean, it is nerve-wracking, and I absolutely understand when you're early on in your career, it is difficult to do that, but you've just got to take a deep breath and go for it.
There's a further question on feedback here, which you've partially answered, I think, but how do you sift the feedback you receive about your behavior, particularly knowing that same behavior can be interpreted differently if exhibited by women and men? How do you choose which is true and constructive and which is biased and toxic?
I think that's a really good question, and obviously incredibly difficult to answer, because you know, some feedback will come from a single, you know, depending who it's from, you know, will come from 1 or 2 data points. And so then they'll, you know, give you a sort of assertive piece of feedback, which you think is just simply not correct. In which case, I think, again, you have to trust your own judgment to say, do I think that feedback is fair? And is there something I could have done differently? And should I have done differently? And if the answer is you don't think it's particularly fair, I think it's worth, again, engaging in that, in some level of dialogue to say why you don't think in this case the feedback is quite right. But I think you have to take the feedback in the round, because for the most part, I think people are, I mean, it's much cheaper to grow up smart people and train them than it is to have high levels of turnover. So I think the assumption must be that in general, feedback is being given in good faith in order to help people improve the way they work. And so then the question is, well, can you take the feedback that really will help you and try and reconcile the, you know, feedback that you may think is incorrect with what actually has gone on? Because I certainly think, you know, politics will play roles, and there will be feedback that inevitably for everybody will be negative at times. And in fact, you know, even the best leaders will be breaking eggs as they go along. I don't think anybody can always be friends with everybody, no matter what they do. So I think you're bound to end up with some detractors, and it's just a matter of balancing it and recognizing that, and then seeing if there's a way that you can handle that better going forward. But actually, the single best thing, again, for me, when even my peers, and certainly people that are more junior in my organization, when they can give me feedback, that is incredibly ballsy and incredibly helpful. Mm-hmm. So, and one of my partners will give me very blunt feedback, who's a physician, and I think it's, in some ways, you know, you think of physicians and they're having to tell patients about life and death decisions, and actually it's not that surprising that they're really good at giving feedback, because they can say so without it being sort of judgmental. It's just, you know, this is the way you came across at that meeting, or have you thought about doing it this way because this is what's happening based on, you know, your personal approach. So I think there's a lot we can learn actually from doctors in how we take and receive feedback.
I'm going to go back to the question which I skipped over, and it was, how do you feel a company such as Arup can learn from the pandemic going forward?
Ooh.
Maybe that should be what you all learn.
I mean, I think what we can all learn is about common purpose, because again, when I look at my team, and again, just in terms of how the team was comprised, about half of it was from the private sector. So people that were experts in manufacturing, clinical, vaccine R&D, sort of long-term industry preparedness. And so those were the sort of specialist skills we had. And then the other set of skills came from within government, which themselves, those individuals, actually many of them had originally come from the private sector, but you know, commercial and international collaboration and project management. And you know, when I look back and say, well, why was this team so effective? I think it really was about this sort of underlying common purpose, and nobody needed to be reminded what our goals were, or why it was so important, or why they should actually lose their weekends, evenings, you know, 24/7 to actually blitz things. So I think sort of thinking, how do you apply it to Arup? Common sense of purpose, I think, is really important. I think the team aspect of recognizing that each person is there for a reason, and they bring some very specific skills and backgrounds and experiences, and they're contributing that to the team. So everybody is valued, even if you don't necessarily agree with them. They will have a valuable sense of point of view. So I think the sort of the team aspects and single team, one team philosophy is important. And then I think afterwards, it's also saying thank you. You know, when people have bust the gut to do things, you know, be nice, recognize people, bring the personal aspect into it, because it's so easy to get your heads into, you know, numbers and data and percentages of efficacy, or, you know, numbers of doses being manufactured per day, or whatever it may be. But actually, you know, after all, everyone is human. Everyone's been impacted by this pandemic in some way, and we need to actually recognise that with people. And so that, I think, is also, and so within SV and also within the Vaccine Taskforce, you know, just little presents every so often, or little just recognition that it's somebody's birthday, or you know, something's happened, and then we can all celebrate it together. So just recognising that we all may be a fantastic sort of single team working forward, but there are things that are going on in people's lives that are nice to call out and celebrate.
The next one, and I realise we've got about 7 minutes to go, so I'm going to fit in a few last questions. But this one is, before important meetings in male-dominated environments, do you consciously consider how you will behave and how you will come across, or do you just trust your natural style?
Yeah, I'm sure I'm going to give you the answer that people say you shouldn't do, but no, I just go for it. And I don't do a lot of thinking about how do I come across. I mean, I'm quite happy to wear a t-shirt on a Zoom meeting with the Prime Minister, so I don't really care what I look like. And I'm not, as you can probably tell, too concerned about being direct. So no, I don't spend too much time worrying about it. I probably should, but I don't.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to skip a few questions because there's one here that has 22 thumbs up, and it maybe, you know, follows on nicely from the last one. As a graduate engineer, there have already been numerous instances when older male engineers don't take me seriously and don't show me the respect because I'm a woman. Outside of Arup, I've been called a clever little girl, and I'm subject to other inappropriate comments. Do you have any advice on how to deal with this personally, or how we can deal with this as an industry?
Well, I think that is outrageous, and I think those dinosaurs are going to go extinct. So I think the way to deal with it is probably not to have a big fight at the time, but to constantly, whoever the different angles are within Arup or anywhere else, is just to call it out in a nice way and just say, you know what, I think there is a perspective here that should be thought about. And also, people like you, Dervilla, is to make sure that you are visible and have a voice and can set role models in very male-dominated industries. And so I think it's completely critical. And I mean, I'm really sad it's still going on, but it won't. And it won't because people are going to call it out. And those individuals that think that only men can build bridges or whatever it may be are of the past, not of the people that are going to be changing the world.
Another toughie one here is, because it moves to another area here, is how are you elevating other women, especially those who have not had the same privileged education as you? And says, and BAME women. I think it means consider BAME women.
Yeah. So again, my view is diversity of thinking is incredibly important. And even if you're highly diverse in terms of gender, if everybody has an identical background like me, you know, very privileged, Oxford, Harvard, you know, all very establishmenty, that is not going to give you the same diversity of thought or creativity as if you get people who come from different backgrounds with different both educational as well as life backgrounds. So I think it is important, and we definitely focus as much on, if I think about my companies, about as much on the actual operational expertise and what experiences people have had in the different companies and how they can then make a contribution going forward, as we do on, you know, academic backgrounds. Now, academic is clearly helpful, but for example, the apprenticeship scheme that we've seen that's been led in the bioscience industry and specifically advanced manufacturing has been game changing. So here, instead of going to university, people can join into the apprenticeship scheme. They can end up with undergraduate degrees, with PhDs, and a depth of experience and skills that far outcompetes, you know, someone who's got a background from Oxford and Harvard. So I'm massively in favour of diversity of thought, of approach and style, and I think again it's in this world of greater openness and less hierarchy, it's something that we should all be embracing.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm going to fit in one last one, which is a question which we're asking all our speakers this week, which is, you know, before COVID, we were all very, you know, thinking about climate change and the impact upon our planet. So what are the things that you've implemented in your own life to reduce your carbon footprint?
I bicycle to work. I have a compost heap, so all my vegetable stuff is recycled and put onto my vegetable garden. We have non-carbon power. So I've got ground source or air source heat pumps and solar panels. And I will hopefully never have to fly anything like as much again now based on this pandemic. So that's not something that I've necessarily volunteered for, because historically I did used to have to fly a lot. Now, I think it's become so clear that you can do so much of your work by not flying that this is a future commitment, which is I will never fly anywhere close as much as I did historically ever again.
Let's see if we can all keep to that. I think we all in our business aspire to do the same, as we recognize we all traveled far too much, and actually Teams is a wonderful way of connecting with others. So I think we've reached the end of our time together, and I'd like to say on my behalf, Kate, thank you so much for giving your time this morning to us here in Arup. It's really been interesting to get your perspectives on life, work, and also to get some more insight on what happened in the vaccine programme. We're proud of the work you've done, and thank you on behalf of Arupians and the UK for what you've done. We're all benefiting. So I'm going to hand now back to Caroline to close us out with 1 minute to go.
Thank you, Dervilla.
Just to echo Dervilla there, to say a massive thank you to Kate for joining us this morning. There is so much that we can take from her conversation there. Just a few things that struck me was I really loved the point about making things relevant and real to people, to engage with them, sharing what you want to achieve and asking what you need to do to get there when we are talking about constructive feedback. And then I think a point about being human and recognizing and celebrating our achievements and milestones are just